The champagne flute shattered on the marble floor, but the silence that followed was far more deafening than the crash. It wasn't the broken glass that destroyed the marriage. It was the way her eyes instinctively darted to her boss for reassurance, instead of her husband. A micro gesture that screamed 1,000 betrayals. Everyone saw the accident, but only he saw the choice she had made long before the glass hit the ground. If you are drawn to stories about the quiet, devastating moments that change lives forever and the cold precision of justice served cold, stay with me because the hardest part isn't the leaving, it's the return. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made everything slick and harder to hold on to. Ethan Cole stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of their downtown apartment, watching the traffic on I-5 bleed into red and white streaks. The glass was cold against his forehead. Behind him, the master bedroom was a flurry of frantic movement and the sharp zip of a dress that cost more than his first car. "You're not wearing the blue tie," Sarah said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Ethan turned. Sarah stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting the straps of a silver gown that clung to her like a second skin. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but her beauty had sharpened recently. It had become a weapon she polished for everyone else but him. "I didn't know I was coming," Ethan said, his voice low. "You said it was a board-only dinner." Julian changed his parameters. "He wants spouses there. It makes the company look stable." She didn't look at him. She was too busy scrutinizing her reflection, checking for flaws that didn't exist. Just put on the black suit. "And please, Ethan, try to be engaging tonight. Don't just stand in the corner talking about server or chitticure." "I don't talk about servers at parties, Sarah. You bore people, Ethan. That is the point." She finally turned to him, her eyes scanning him with a mixture of fatigue and irritation. "Julian needs this night to go perfectly. The investors are skittish." Julian, the name hung in the air between them, heavier than the humidity. Julian Vance was the CEO of Vance Dynamics, Sarah's boss, and literally the third person in their marriage. He was the reason Sarah's phone lit up at 11 p.m. He was the reason she started buying distinct expensive perfume that she washed off immediately upon coming home. Ethan walked over to the dresser and picked up his watch. "Is that why you've been late every night this week preparing Fortnite?" Sarah froze. Her hand hovered over her jewelry box. "I'm the VP of marketing, Ethan. It's my job. Don't start this insecure jealousy thing again. It's exhausting." "I'm not jealous," Ethan lied. He wasn't jealous. He was grieving. He was grieving a woman who was standing right in front of him. "I just missed my wife." Sarah laughed a dry, hollow sound. "God, you're suffocating. Do you know that? You want me to be some housewife who waits by the door?" "I have ambition, Ethan. I'm building something." "I built this life with you," Ethan reminded her gently. She spun around, her eyes flashing. "You provided a paycheck. That's not the same thing as building an empire. Julian understands that." It was the comparison. Ethan stepped closer, reaching out to fix a stray lock of hair falling over her shoulder. It was a reflex, a musclemory of affection. "Sarah, I just want us to be okay." She flinched. She actually pulled back as Ifa's touch burned her skin. The silence that followed was absolute. The rain lashed against the window harder now. "Don't," she whispered, smoothing the fabric where his hand had been near. "I have to be in the zone. Tonight, I can't have you dragging me down with your emotional baggage." "Dragging you down?" Ethan asked, his hand dropping to his side. Sarah looked at him, and for a second the mask slipped. He didn't see anger. He saw contempt. Pure, unfiltered disappointment. "Honestly, Ethan," she said, grabbing her clutch and heading for the door without waiting for him. "Sometimes I look at you and I wonder how we even make sense anymore. You're so static. I'd rather sleep on the floor of the office than come back here and pretend this works." The door clicked shut. Ethan stood alone in the expensive, tastefully decorated apartment that felt like a mausoleum. "I'd rather sleep on the floor." He looked at the black suit hanging in the closet. He looked at the wedding photo on the dresser taken 5 years ago where she looked at him like he hung the moon. Then he looked at his phone, a text from his lawyer sent hours ago, which hadn't opened yet. He didn't put on the suit. He walked to the window and watched Sarah emerge from the building below. A black town car was waiting. The rear door opened, and a man, Julian, stepped out to hold an umbrella for her. Ethan saw the way Julian's hand lingered on the small of her back, the way Sarah leaned into him, seeking shelter. It wasn't an affair. It was a replacement. Ethan turned away from the window. The calmness that washed over him was terrifying. He didn't feel like crying. He felt like a man who finally understood the architectural flaw in a building he had been trying to save. You didn't. Patch the cracks in a foundation that is rotting. You condemn the structure. He walked to the closet but didn't reach for the suit. He reached for his suitcase. The suitcase was packed. It sat in the trunk of Ethan's sedan, a solitary black box containing the essentials of a life being dismantled. Yet Ethan drove the car toward the dazzling lights of the Seattle Art Museum, where the Vance Dynamics Gala was in full swing. Hadn't. Go to fight for her. He went because the scientist in him required empirical data. He needed to verify the hypothesis that his marriage was not just dying but dead. He handed his keys to the valet, ignoring the pitying look the young man gave. His older, modest sedan amidst a sea of Porsches and Maseratis. Inside, the air was conditioned to a crisp chill and smelled of expensive lies and ambition. Their room was a kaleidoscope of black ties and designer gowns, a murmuring hive of Seattle's elite. Ethan stood at that periphery holding a glass of sparkling water he didn't intend to drink. He felt invisible, a ghost haunting the celebration of his wife's success. He spotted them near the center of the room. They were magnetic. Sarah in her silver gown looked like a statue cast in moonlight. Julian stood beside her, one hand casually resting on the back of her chair, a territorial claim that everyone in the room seemed to accept. They weren't touching inappropriately, not technically, but their body language spoke a dialect of intimacy that screamed louder than sex. They leaned in together to laugh at a joke, their shoulders brushing, creating a close circle that locked the rest of the world out. Ethan drifted closer, moving through the crowd like smoke. He stopped a bend, a pillar wrapped in white roses just a few feet away from their circle. The Q3 numbers are aggressive. A board member was saying, raising a glass to Julian. But you two seem to have the magic touch. It's all about partnership, Julian said, his voice smooth, carrying that easy confidence that money buys. He looked down at Sarah. Sarah is the vision. I just clear the path. Sarah beamed, her face flushed with a vitality Ethan hadn't seen in years. Julian is being modest. He's the force of nature. And what about Ethan? Another voice asked. It was a junior executive, perhaps unaware of the room's unspoken script. Is he here tonight? The air in the small circle shifted. The temperature seemed to drop. Sarah didn't look for him in the crowd. She didn't scan the room to wave her husband over. Instead, she took a sip of champagne, her expression tightening into something resembling pity. Ethan isn't really built for this, Sarah said, her voice clear, cutting through the ambient jazz. He prefers the background. Honestly, it's better this way. I need someone who runs at my pace. Going home to him is like hitting the brakes on a Ferrari. It's sharing. The group chuckled politely, an uncomfortable sound that grated against Ethan's ears. Mediocrity is safe, though, Julian added, a smirk playing on his lips as he swirled his drink. Every star needs a quiet, dark room to rest in, right, Sarah? I'd rather not rest, Sarah replied, looking directly into Julian's eyes, ignoring the others. I'd rather sleep on the floor of your office than go back to that safety. The instant sense by confirmation hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just an affair of the body. It was a total rejection of his existence. He was the safety she despised. He stepped out from behind the pillar. He didn't mean to make a sound, but his movement caught the light. Sarah's peripheral vision picked him up. She turned, the smile freezing on her face, her eyes widened, locking onto his. For a heartbeat, time suspended. Ethan looked at her. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sad. He looked at her with the terrifying clarity of a stranger. Sarah's hand trembled. The crystal flute she was holding slipped from her fingers. Crash. The sound of shattering glass silenced the nearby conversations. Champagne splattered across the marble floor and onto the hem of her silver dress. In that frozen second, the hook off the trap snapped shut. Sarah didn't look at the mess. She didn't look at Ethan to apologize. Her eyes darted instantly, instinctively to Julian. She looked to him for reassurance, for protection. For cue on how to react. Ethan saw the look. The entire room saw the look. Julian stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Sarah's arm, effectively blocking her from her husband. "It's just a glass," Julian said, his voice commanding. "Let's get this cleaned up." Ethan looked at the broken shards near his polish. And shoes. He didn't help her, he didn't speak. He realized he was the only one in the room who knew that the glass wasn't the unliving that had just been destroyed beyond repair. He turned his back on them. "Ethan," Sarah called us out, her voice faint, unsure. He didn't stop. He walked toward the exit, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the renewed murmur of the crowd. He walked past the valet, past the doorman, and out into Thrain. He walked straight to his car where the suitcase was waiting. The apartment was exactly as they had left it, warm, impeccably staged, and completely devoid of life. Ethan moved through the rooms, not like a husband, but like a crime scene cleaner, removing evidence of a struggle that had lasted for years. He didn't scream. He didn't take a golf club to the television or shred the designer clothes in her closet. That was the reaction of a man who still hoped for a reaction. Ethan had moved past hope into the cold clarity of calculation. He sat at the kitchen island, the marble cool under his fingertips. He opened his laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dim light. With a few keystrokes, he initiated the transfers. The joint savings, which had largely funded, were split 50-50ths. He wasn't vindictive. He was precise. He left her the apartment, the furniture, and the lease. He took only what was liquid and what was his. Transfer complete. He closed the laptop and slid it into his leather messenger bag. Next, he pulled a thick manila envelope from the bag. The divorce papers. He had met with the attorney 3 weeks ago. A contingency plan he had prayed he wouldn't need. Tonight, the floor comet had signed them for him. He placed the envelope on the center of the kitchen island directly under the pendant light. It was impossible, Thomas. He walked into the bedroom for the last time. The scent of her perfume, sandalwood, and ambition lingered in the air. The bed was made, the duvet smoothed to perfection. Ethan looked at his left hand. The gold band felt heavy, a shackle disguised as a promise. He twisted it off. The skin underneath was pale, marked by 5 years of wearing it. He placed the ring on her pillow. It sat there, a small gold circle against the white cotton, looking incredibly small and insignificant. He checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. she would be leaving the gala soon, likely going for drinks with the team, buoyed by the adrenaline of the night and Julian's attention. She wouldn't be home until 2 a.m. He had plenty of time. Ethan picked up his suitcase and the messenger bag. He didn't look back. There was no cinematic pause at the doorway to memorize the life he was leaving. He simply stepped out and closed the door. The lock clicked shut, with a finality that echoed in the hallway. The Uber ride to SeaTac International Airport was a blur of rain-streaked windows and neon lights. Seattle was weeping, but Ethan felt age-scorched earth inside his chest. At the terminal, he checked. And at the self-service kiosk. Destination Berlin thought it was far enough. It was cold enough, a place of concrete and steel where he could rebuild himself from the ground up. As he sat at the gate, waiting for boarding group A, his phone buzzed in his hand. Sarah, wife, it was 1:30 a.m. She must be on her way home, or perhaps just wanted to check if he was sulking. The phone buzzed again and again. A text message appeared on the screen. "Where did you go? You're embarrassing me." Ethan looked at the words. They held no power over him anymore. They were just pixels on a screen. He took a small metal pin from his wallet and ejected the SIM card from the side of the phone. The device went dark. He walked over to a trash can, nerf vending machines, and dropped the tiny chip into the abyss of coffee cups and sandwich wrappers. Flight Elch 491 to Frankfurt with connection to Berlin is now boarding. Ethan stood up. He picked up his bag. He was no longer Sarah's husband. He was no longer the mediocrity holding her back. He was a ghost, and ghosts didn't answer text messages. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant, walked down the jet bridge, and didn't look back at the city that was slowly disappearing into the dark, wet night. 5 years is a lifetime in the tech world. In Seattle, it was enough time for Vance Dynamics to go from the industry's golden child to a cautionary tale of bloat and mismanagement. Sarah Vance, she had taken his name a year after the divorce was finalized, sat in her corner office, massaging her temples. The view was the same. as it had always been. Rain, gray skyscrapers, and the endless stream of traffic on I-5, but the reflection in the glass was different. The lines around her eyes were deeper, edged by stress and the constant grinding pressure of keeping Julian's ego inflated while the stock price plummeted. "You're not listening to me, Sarah," Julian's voice boomed from the doorway. He didn't knock. Anymore. The charm that had seduced her at galas and board dinners had eroded, revealing a volatile, insecure man who blamed the world for his failures. Sarah turned, her expression practiced and neutral. "I am listening, Julian, but we can't pivot AI without the infrastructure. We lost our lead engineering team last quarter because you refused to match thiefers from Google. I refuse to be held hostage by nerds." Julian slammed a folder onto her desk. "Fix it. That's your job. Use that marketing magic you're so proud of. Spin it. Tell them we're retooling. Just stop the stock from sliding another 4 points." He stormed out, leaving the door wide open. Sarah stared at the empty space. The magic he spoke of had run dry years ago. She looked down at her hand. The diamond on her finger was massive. Rock that drew gasps at parties, but it felt like a shackle. Shahad traded a man who would have walked through fire for a man who used her as a human shield against his own incompetence. She opened her drawer and glanced at the bottle. Of Xanax tucked in the back, she didn't take one. She just needed to know it was there. 5,000 miles away in a sleek glass-walled officio-overlooking the Spree River in Berlin, the atmosphere was a vacuum of silence and precision. Ethan Cole stood looking out at the Fernsturm, the television tower cutting through the twilight. He didn't look like the man who had left a wedding ring on a pillow in Seattle. That man had been soft, rounded at the edges by domestic complacency. This man was sharp, tailored in a charcoal suit that cost more than his old car, his posture rigid. He was no longer just an engineer. He was the founder of Aurelius Group, a private equity firm driven by an algorithmic predictive model he had written him. During his sleepless nights in exile, the ghost algorithm, the industry called it. It predicted corporate collapse with terrifying accuracy, allowing Aurelius to swoop in, strip the assets, and rebuild or dismantle the target. Her Cole Ethan didn't turn. He recognized the voice of his chief analyst. "Lena, the report on the North American sector is ready," Lena said, stepping into the room and placing a tablet on the minimalist black desk. "There is a candidate that fits the acquisition parameters. High brand recognition, significant IP, but suffering from catastrophic leadership failure and liquidity issues." Ethan finally turned. His face was a mask of indifference. "Which one?" "Vance Dynamics," Lena said. The name hung in the cold air of the office. For a second, Ethan felt a phantom ache in his chest. A ghost limb from a life amputated 5 years ago, but it passed instantly, replaced by the hum of the air filtration system. He walked to the desk and picked up the tablet. He scrolled through the charts, the red lines dipping aggressively toward the chaotic spending reports signed by Julian Vance. The desperate press releases drafted by Sarah. He saw her face in a recent press clipping attached to the file. She looked tired. She looked like someone who was drowning in the deep end she had fought so hard to swim in. "Their debt is toxic," Lena noted. "The board is looking for a lifeline." "A white knight." "They don't need a white knight," Ethan said. His voice flat, devoid of mercy. "They need a mortician." He tapped the screen, highlighting the company's valuation. It was a fraction of what it had been when he left. "Prepare the liquidity," Ethan ordered, setting the tablet down. "We don't just want a stake. We want a controlling interest." "I want 51%. It will be a hostile entry," Lena warned. "The CEO, Mr. Vance. We'll fight it." Ethan walked back to the window, watching the lights of Berlin flicker on. "Let him fight," Ethan said softly. "It makes the purchase cheaper." The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled of stale coffee and fear. It was a distinctive scent. Sharp and metallic, emanating from the 12 board members sitting around the mahogany table. Outside, the Sidaleski was a bruising purple, threatening a storm that matched the turbulence inside. Sarah sat at the far end of Feedable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. On the large screen at the front of the room, the fiscal year projections were bleeding red. "We are hemorrhaging cash," the CFO, Marcus, said. His voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at Julian. Nobody looked at Julian anymore with respect. They looked at him with a mixture of dread and litigation anxiety. At this burn rate, we missed payroll in 3 weeks. We are insolvent. Julian Vance paced the front of the room like a caged animal. His tie was loosened, his hair unkempt. A stark contrast to the polished CEO Sarah had left her husband 4 or 5 years ago. He slammed his hand on the table, making the water pitchers jump. "It's a market correction," Julian shouted, his eyes bloodshot. "The product is fine. It's the messaging. Sarah isn't selling the vision." All eyes turned to Sarah. The accusation was absurd and everyone knew it. The product was buggy, the updates were delayed, and Julian had spent TAER&D budget on a failed expansion into crypto. But Sarah didn't fight back. She was too tired. She had spent 5 years selling the vision, protecting Julian Sego and covering up his mistakes. She was hollowed out. "The messaging can't fix a broken algorithm, Julian," Sarah said quietly. "Don't you dare, Julian." Started stepping toward her. "Gentlemen," Marcus interrupted, sliding a thick black folder across the table. "We have an alternative to bankruptcy. It arrived this morning via courier from Zurich." The room fell silent. Marcus appended the folder. "It is a tender offer for a majority acquisition, a complete takeover of all outstanding debt, and a cash injection to stabilize operations." "Who is it?" a board member asked, leaning forward. "Google? Microsoft?" "No," Marcus replied, adjusting his glasses. "A private equity firm called Aurelius Group. European, very private, very deep pockets." "Aurelius?" Julian scoffed, snatching the folder. "Never heard of them." "Some Euro trash fund trying to buy American innovation for pennies on the dollar. I won't sell my legacy to a ghost." "Your legacy is currently worth $12 million, Julian." Marcus sighed, his patience finally snapping. "This isn't a negotiation. The bank calls the loan on Friday. Aurelius is offering to pay it off on Thursday. They are the only reason we won't be in handcuffs for fraud." Sarah reached for the folder as Julian threw it down in disgust. She ran her fingers over the logo, a stylized golden spear. The offer was aggressive. It demanded 51% control, immediate board restructuring, and the resignation of key redundant personnel. But the valuation, it was generous, suspiciously generous. "Why May?" Sarah asked, voicing the thought that pricked at the back of her neck. "Why would they overpay for a sinking ship?" "Maybe they see the potential you failed to capitalize on." Julian snapped, pouring himself a glass of water with a trembling hand. He looked around the room, seeing the defeat in the eyes of his board. He realized he had no leverage. "Fine, let them have it. We take the money, we stabilize, and once the stock bounce back, we buy them out. We use their cash to save my company." "They want to close a deal in person," Marcus added. "Their principal is flying in. The signing is scheduled for tomorrow at noon." Sarah felt the chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It felt too easy. It felt like a trap. But she looked at Julian, sweating, arrogant, and failing, and realized she had no other choice. "Set the meeting?" Sarah said, closing the folder. She didn't know it then, but Shah had just signed the permission slip for her own reckoning. The storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the glass, blurring the world into a gray smear. The clock on the wall of the executive boardroom ticked with agonizing slowness. It was 11:59 a.m. Around the long mahogany table, the air was thin. Julian sat at the head, fidgeting with his cufflinks, trying to project the image of a CEO brokering a partnership rather than a desperate man signing his surrender. Sarah sat to his right, her hands cold. She wore a severe navy suit, armor for a battle she didn't fully understand. The rest of the board sat in silence, looking at their phones, avoiding eye contact. "They're late," Julian muttered, checking his watch for the 3rd time. Typical European power play. "Make us wait. Show us who has the time." "It's 1 minute to noon, Julian," Sarah said softly, her eyes fixed on the heavy double doors at the end of the room. "They aren't late." As if on cue, the handles turned. The doors didn't bang open. They swung wide with a smooth, heavy silence. 2 men in darks, gray suits entered first, lawyers clearly. They carried briefcases that looked like they contained nuclear codes. They didn't speak. They simply moved to the empty side of the table and began laying out documents with surgical precision. Then a woman entered. Sarah recognized the sharp bob cut and thief-efficient manner. Lena, the analyst whose name was on the emails. She stood by the door and held it open. That principal of Aurelius Group, she announced. A man walked in. He was tall. He wore a three-piece suit cut from the fabric that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. He moved with a predatory grace, his stride confident, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't look a savior. He looked like a judgment. Julian squinted, leaning forward. Who the hell? Sarah stopped breathing. The world tilted on its axis. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder. She knew that walk. She knew the set of those shoulders, even if they were broader now. She knew the way he held his left hand, thumb brushing against the index finger. The man reached the other end of the table, the end opposite Julian. He placed a single other folder on the wood. Then he looked up. It was Ethan, but it wasn't Ethan she had known. The soft jawline was hidden beneath a neatly trimmed dark beard. The glasses were gone. The eyes, once warm and eager to please, were now cold shards of slate dot. There was no love in them. There was no hate. There was absolutely nothing, gentlemen, Ethan said. His voice was deeper, stripped of the hesitation that used to annoy her. Vance. The sound off her name, her married name, coming from his lips was like a slap. Julian stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward, crashing onto the floor. Ethan, is this a joke? He looked from Ethan to the lawyers, then back to Sarah. This is the buyer, your ex-husband, the guy you fixed servers. Sit down, Mr. Vance, Ethan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Julian's outburst. Hal looked at the documents. Unless you prefer to conduct this bankruptcy hearing in court next week. You can have this kind of money, Julian stammered, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. You're a nobody. You walked out with a suitcase. And I returned with a conglomerate. Ethan replied calmly. Heffinally looked at Julian, a gaze so withering it made the CEO shrink. Aurelius Group owns the debt. We own the building you are standing in. And as of 5 minutes ago, when the wire transfer cleared pending signatures, we own you. Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat was constricted by a knot of panic and regret so large it threatened to choke her. She looked at Ethan, searching for a trace of the man who used to bring her coffee in bed. The man she'd call a mediocre. He wasn't there. Ethan pulled a blank pen from his pocket. He uncapped it, the sound sharp in the desolate room. Shall we proceed? Ethan asked, looking directly at Sarah. I have a tight schedule, and this company requires significant restructuring. He sat down at the head of the table. Julian was left standing red-faced and impotent, while Sarah remained frozen in her chair, realizing with terrifying clarity that the floor she had once threatened to sleep on now belonged to him. The meeting ended not with a bang, but with a quiet shuffle off papers. The lawyers packed their briefcases. The board members, sensing the shift in gravity, filed out quickly, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Vance administration. Julian had been the last to leave, escorted by security after threatening to sue Aurelius Group for everything from fraud to emotional distress. His voice echoed down the hallway, pathetic and shrinking, until the heavy doors clicked shut. Now, the room was silent, just the hum of the vodka and the rain against the glass. Ethan remained seated at the head of the table, typing something on his tablet. He didn't look up, even though he knew Sarah was still standing there, gripping the back of the leather chair Julian had vacated. Ethan, she said, her voice was trembling, stripped of the corporate tapelish she wore like armor. Mr. Cole, he corrected without stopping his typing. We are in a place of business, Mrs. Vance. Sarah flinched. She walked around the table, stopping. A few feet from him. Please stop it. The lawyers are gone. It's just us. It's just Sarah and Ethan. He finally stopped typing. He set the stylus down and looked up at her. His eyes were dry, unreadable. There is no Sarah and Ethan. There hasn't been for 5 years. There is only the chairman of the board and the vice president of marketing. And currently, the vice president of marketing is presiding over a brand that has lost 40% of its market share. I did what I had to do, Sarah pleaded, her hands reaching out instinctively, then dropping when she saw him recoil slightly. You don't understand the pressure I was under, Julian. He promised me the world. He said we were building a legacy. And I see you built it, Ethan said, gesturing to the empty room. A bankrupt legacy. I made a mistake, she whispered, tears finally spilling over. I was blinded. I thought you were holding me back. I thought I needed someone who burned as bright as I did. But he just burned everything down. She took a step closer. But you came back, you bought company. You must still care. You wouldn't have spent millions just to fire Julian if you didn't still feel something for me. Ethan stood up. He walked over to the window, turning his back on her to look at the city. He now owned a significant piece of austere importance in my portfolio. Sarah, the words hung in the air cold and sharp. I didn't buy Vance Dynamics to